So Nisha, what are the odds on this one getting demonetised for all the copyrighted music we're about to use?
I'd say about 99%.
Thanks, YouTube. Always make it easy for us creators. Regardless of how you feel about the movie Guardians of the Galaxy, I think we can all generally agree that the person who gave James Gunn permission to go that hard on the soundtrack is a fucking legend and possibly a hero. A soundtrack, it turns out, pretty much the entire production crew listened to on repeat on set while they were making the movie.
Okay, so this is one of my favourite Marvel films, and I know there's a lot of music in there, so how did the soundtrack originally come about?
Well, when James Gunn made the decision to hinge a lot of the scenes in the movie on music, specifically music from the 70s and 80s, the very first thing he did is went and downloaded as much music from the 70s as 80s as possible, and then began culling all of the songs that he thought were too popular or too cheesy. So before we move on, Nisha, as this is your favourite Marvel film, what cheesy 80s pop song would you have unironically loved to appear in the film Guardians of the Galaxy and have a scene set around it? Because I'm guessing people already know what my answer is, and that is, of course, the song Africa by Toto, because that song is a fucking banger and it never ceases to slap. But I'm curious what your answer is.
I would love to see Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley in it.
Oh, man, like...
Can you imagine?
That song is really good, and it's one of the most famous songs from the 80s. People might be thinking, well, if the whole plan was to hinge entire scenes of the movie on popular songs from the 80s, why didn't they pick the biggest hits everybody knows today? And James Gunn's reasoning for not including songs like that is kind of genius and really hard to argue against. The framing device of these songs appearing in the movie is a mixtape made for Star-Lord, and that mixtape wouldn't be a collection of the best songs, it would be a collection of his favourite songs. And there's probably a lot of songs from the 80s that were people's favourite songs that aren't as well known or remembered today.
Well, I think that's a pretty good idea, how he's gone about that, because it's Star-Lord's favourite music. It's like when you've got your own Spotify playlist, it'll be like your favourite songs.
Yeah, you don't necessarily have a greatest hits collection of the eras that you've lived through. So again, Nisha, let's refer to our own musical taste for a moment here. We are both 90s kids, yeah? So we grew up in the 90s.
Yep.
The 90s is the era which we are going to grow up, like, fondly remembering. And the thing that happened with the 80s in regards to music, there just been a lot of famous hits from that era that are just now considered classics. Hasn't really happened with the 90s so much, has it?
Not really, no.
But there are a few of those huge mega hits that everybody knows from the 90s. But let's ignore the fuck out of those and use the same reasoning James Gunn did picking the songs for Guardians of the Galaxy, and just say, in a theoretical best of 90s playlist, that is the best of the 90s in our opinion, what are some obscure songs from that era you would include?
Well, a song that I used to really like, which I think people forget existed, was one of Christina Aguilera's songs, Genie in a Bottle.
Okay.
A lot of people remember her for that song Dirty and Beautiful and stuff like that, but people forget Genie in a Bottle, which I think was a really good song.
People forget Genie in a Bottle. And I'm going to go in a completely opposite direction, and I'm going to go for the entire 90s output of the band Scooter. Because nobody talks about Scooter today, but Scooter was so fucking big in the 90s. You heard Nisha's reaction when I said Scooter. When's the last time you thought about Scooter, Nisha? Because was it the 90s?
Well, actually, I have a song on my Spotify by Scooter, and I skipped through it the other day. I was like, oh yeah, Scooter.
Because you grew up in the 90s, and that's a song that was big back then. That isn't as well now, but you grew up and you remember it. So I want to say everything Scooter put out, because they were massive during the 90s, and I think they're still big today. Oh, the Logic song's fucking huge. That kick-started the whole thing of high-pitched, auto-tuned girls singing over a dance track. Like David Guetta owes his entire fucking career to Scooter. Oh, let me just sort this out. Oh, yeah, I'm wearing a hat today because fuck dealing with this lid. I'm sorry, guys. But I'm getting a big sweaty head. It's got a massive fat head.
So I've always been a big fan of 80s songs myself because that's all I grew up with. Because my mum was endlessly listening to 80s CDs over and over again, and it's I feel like I lived in that era, even though I was born in the 90s. I feel like I lived through the 80s.
Well, I had the same thing because my mum would listen to a lot of Roxette and Cyndi Lauper, and if people don't know the fuck Roxette is, it's exactly that, right? Roxette, she was big in the 80s, not so much now. And then my dad was just he listened to his fucking Rod Stewart endlessly.
My mum's was Rick Astley was one of her favourites, ABBA, Jason Donovan, that sort of thing. So cheesy.
It's cheesy, but again, That was the criteria for James Gunn, to bring it back to Guardians of the Galaxy. It was, he didn't want those cheesy pop hits everybody knows, because that wouldn't feel organic to the movie. And I think it was the right call, because the Guardians of the Galaxy framing device of like, it's a headset that he's listening to, gave them an out for playing music, because so many films will play music without any rhyme or reason. I think Suicide Squad is a sterling example of like how bad it can be, where they just threw pop songs at the wall.
So I previously mentioned James Gunn downloaded like hundreds of 80s songs and then whittled it down to a few dozen. So how did he decide which ones ended up in the movie?
He did what I think a lot of people did after that film got released, and listened to those songs on repeat until one just gelled with him. Because he was writing the movie, and while he was writing, he was listening to the soundtrack, and on occasion he'd go, well, hang on, this scene would go great with this song. And other times he heard a song and went, this song would be a great background to a scene, and he would write scenes around the song, or he would rearrange scenes to fit songs, and like, you know, mix and match in that mentality until he got the playlist that ended up in the movie. And I believe James Gunn just collated all the songs that were in that initial master list that he was choosing from and just put it on Spotify. And if I'm remembering that correctly, there will be a link to that below, so we can go list it. And it's just, here's like the 80 or so songs from which I had to choose the eventual final soundtrack. And there's some fucking bangers on there. And that's, I think, the criteria he wanted. He wanted songs that people would recognise, but may not necessarily remember all that well. Which is a good way of doing it, because if he'd gone with what I guess other directors who didn't give as much of a shit would have done, just picked the biggest hits from the 80s, people might remember those songs a bit better and recognise them. But by the same token, they could also have been annoying.
I also think if you're using songs that are quite unique, when people hear that song again, they'll remember, oh yeah, that's from Guardians of the Galaxy, because it will remind them of those scenes.
Which is why I think the idea was low-key kind of genius, because when people hear some of those big hits like Hooked on a Feeling, and those songs which were popular, but maybe not as popular as like other bigger hits from the 80s are today, they go, oh, that's the song from Guardians of the Galaxy. Whereas if you pick Never Gonna Give You Up or Africa by Toto, people go, oh, that's Africa by Toto, not the song from Guardians of the Galaxy. So again, super genius.
So yeah, the topic of today's article is the fact that the cast of Guardians of the Galaxy listened to the music on set, like actually in person.
They did. And according to James Gunn, what they had was just several music playing devices around on set that were blaring out that aforementioned playlist, so people knew what kind of like mood they were going for with a given scene. So, for example, in the scene in which Chris Pratt is, sprayed with just water and starts exuding that powerful red sex mist, while Hooked on a Feeling blares in the background, that song was actually blaring at full volume on set that day. So Chris Pratt knew exactly how pissed off to look, because he was just literally smouldering with sexual energy.
Hooked on a Feeling was played during that scene where they're basically captured and put in prison.
Yeah, so they were listening to the song that plays during the film to get into the right mood, and as well, like, just move in rhythm, because there's a lot of like rhythmic editing in those scenes, which is, again, why I think the music in that film like works, I guess, whereas it doesn't in other films, like, the ones that we mentioned earlier. And that was true of every other scene in the movie which featured music. If there was a song playing in the background for a shot in the movie, it would be playing on set so the actors could get into the swing of things, metaphorically and quite literally, if they were required to move in beat. Like the one where it's Chris Pratt listening to his headphones, just dancing. He was actually listening to the song. And this reminds me a little bit of the film Napoleon Dynamite. And Nisha, do you remember the bit at the end where you have like John Hader dancing? I forget the name of the song. He's just there doing a cool ass dance for a talent show. A clip of which we'll play now. One of the most famous bits of trivia about that movie is that they didn't play that song on the day. John Hader is dancing to a completely different song.
Oh, is he?
He's dancing to a different song, and they just edited it to make it look like he's dancing to the song he is in the film.
I thought you were going to turn around and say he was dancing to Silence.
Oh no, that happens in a lot of movies though.
Okay, I'm going to guess there was at least one or two exceptions to this. They couldn't play a song for every scene.
Well, there was one exception, and that was the scene where it introduces Nowhere as a David Bowie song plays in the background. And according to James Gunn, he was really hesitant to include that song, which didn't really fit with his ethos of picking songs that the audience would recognise by artists they didn't. because like everyone knows who the fuck David Bowie is. But then he thought to himself and realised making an 80s infused sci-fi film without including David Bowie in some capacity would be close to sacrilegious, and put the song in anyway. The topic of today's video, in a roundabout way, has been movie soundtracks that use licensed music. So in that vein, Nisha, do you have a favourite movie soundtrack that contains licensed music? So the criteria here isn't original music composed for the film itself. It is films like Guardians of the Galaxy that just use already existing songs that you quite enjoy. And while you have a think, I'm going to open the floor with almost every film in the mainline American Pie cinematic universe. Because every single one of those films always has just a sick, awesome pop punk soundtrack that features, similar to the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack, songs and artists that you will recognise but may not remember all that well. But when you hear them go, oh shit, I love that song. So they always have like Good Charlotte and Blink-182 and Green Day and Goldfinger and all those things. Like, man, I really like that song. Why do I not listen to this anymore? This is really hype. I kind of miss this. And in the same vein, I think all of those teen boner comedies from the 90s, like your Eurotrips and You're Not Another Teen Movie, also have unironically good soundtracks because they just picked really solid pop punk music that they go to the background. And I will highlight specifically the film Not Another Teen Movie because they even brought Good Charlotte in to record original music for that film. Have you had enough time to think? Do you have any licensed movie soundtracks that you quite enjoy? I'm saying, audience at home, feel free to suggest yours in the comments if you have any. I'll have a pint down when I do that. I feel like I'm on the news. Do you know when you're watching the news at 5 in the morning and there's that lady in the corner who's just like fucking breaking it down, doing all sign language?
Even if you're watching a film, she's there. You're like,
she
oh
is.
yeah, it's too late. It's too late for me to be up.
You know it's late when you've got a lady in the bottom corner on the BBC just like throwing shapes. I feel though, Nisha, you're stalling because you can't think of a soundtrack. Because you just want to talk about Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh, it's because their soundtrack is one of the best ones I've heard.
You can say Guardians of the Galaxy if you like.
My favourite bit of it is the beginning, the very beginning, because it's quite like dramatic and, you know, mysterious because it's this new film. The first film that's come out, it's a new film. You don't really know what it's going to be about. You don't know what the characters are going to be like. And Peter Quill goes to this planet. You don't see his face because he's wearing a mask. And you're like, oh, it's quite dark and eerie. And then all of a sudden, the music kicks in and the entire like atmosphere changes. And you think, it's going to be one of those films.
It's one of the strongest opening scenes of a Marvel movie, at least, because it establishes the tone so perfectly. And I love in Endgame, where they go back to that planet and you get to see how much of an arsehole Peter Quill looks because he's listening to headphones, and you think, oh yeah, we can hear the soundtrack as the moviegoers, but to an outside observer, he looks like a moron.
So he's an idiot.
That moment where he picks up that like alien rat creature and starts singing into
the rat.
Because like me and Adam are going through like the Marvel films in reading order on Disney Plus at the minute, and Guardians of the Galaxy is where it starts getting like really funny. Like obviously there's funny bits in other films, but Guardians of the Galaxy is the one where it is so funny like all the way through. Like
it's
so
when they settled
quotes.
into the tone. Would it surprise you to learn that most of the funniest parts of those earlier movies were all improv?
No, I can see that.
Almost every line of Robert Downey Jr.'s was improv. In Avengers, the line "He's adopted," that was improv by Chris Hemsworth. And then the other one you have, I think the story he tells about Loki turning into a snake was also improv. And Chris Pratt, in a similar vein, is also really good at improv from his Parks and Rec days. And there's a famous story about this, and it's in one episode. His character had to go onto a computer and just type in on WebMD. Because Chris Pratt improv the line, I typed your symptoms into WebMD, it says you might have network connectivity problems. The writers on the show have gone down and saying, we fucking hate Chris Pratt, because that's the funniest line on the show, and he came up with it on the spot. It's almost like you should let those actors just do their own thing, because they're really fucking good at their job.